Liebe Zuhörende des Kosmos-Streaming-Formats der Kosmos-Vorlesungsaufzeichnungen von 2019. Hier sind wir wieder, Theresa Fromm und Christoph Schneider. Ich bin Professor für Klimageografie am Geografischen Institut der Humboldt-Universität. Theresa, wo bist du her?
Ja, ich bin Postdoc am IRITESIS, das ist das Institut für interdisziplinäre Forschung zum Thema Mensch-Umwelt-Beziehungen.
Und die heutige Folge, die hat ja im Zentrum den Vortrag von Professor Dame Anne Salmond aus Neuseeland, die im Rahmen einer Förderung der Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung in Deutschland schon war in den letzten Jahren und jetzt wieder zu uns nach Berlin gekommen ist für diesen tollen Vortrag 2019. Ja, der hat ja im Zentrum eigentlich Mensch-Umwelt-Beziehungen, vielleicht noch mehr im Zentrum, weil sie ja auch eine Anthropologin ist, Mensch-Mensch-Beziehungen. Wie hast du den Vortrag wahrgenommen?
Ja, ich finde, ist eine gute Ergänzung oder ein guter anderer Blickwinkel nochmal im Vergleich zu dem Vortrag letztes Mal, weil sie einfach zeigt, wie eine andere Kultur schon diesen Kosmosgedanken in der ganzen Tradition in sich hat. Und ich finde das für uns hier sehr europäisch zentriert gut zu sehen und davon zu lernen und das zu verstehen. Und deswegen finde ich beide Vorträge zusammenpassen sehr gut, sich auch zusammen anzuhören.
Ich finde diesen Vortrag auch eine ganz wunderbare Möglichkeit wahrzunehmen, wie unterschiedliche kulturelle Hintergründe dann auch den wissenschaftlichen Diskurs und auch die wissenschaftlichen Blickwinkel unterschiedlich einbringen und kontextuieren. Ganz berührend finde ich, das sind die Szenen, wo sie tatsächlich auch in die Maori-Sprache wechselt, sowohl im Vortrag selber und auch in der Diskussion. Und man dann merkt, dass eben wir so gewohnt sind, mit einem europäischen Blick zu schauen, dass das für uns befremdlich ist, diese Perspektive zu ändern. Und dann machen wir uns aber irgendwie auf den Weg, diese neuen Perspektiven irgendwie wertzuschätzen und gleichzuschätzen. Das finde ich an diesem Vortrag einfach, war für mich das Lehrreichste.
Ja, ich finde auch schön, sie zeigt dann so auf, dass unser Denken ja auch gar nicht, das ist ja nicht sozusagen Gott gegeben, sondern es hat sich ja erst vor 200, 250 Jahren so entwickelt, dass wir so sehr Materielles und Spirituelles trennen, aber dass das nicht etwas ist, was so die Welt so ist, sondern dass es eine kulturelle Prägung ist. Und ich finde, das zeigt sie sehr gut auf, dass man da auch wieder, wie auch ja Alexander von Humboldt, so einen Kosmos-Gedanken hatte, dass wir dazu auch wieder hinkommen können oder müssen, so eigentlich.
Ja, und damit knüpft dieser Vortrag von Dame Anne Salmond ganz hervorragend an den von der letzten Folge mit Wolfgang Lucht an. Und jetzt aber Professor Anne Salmond von der University of Auckland mit ihrem grandiosen Vortrag in englischer Sprache zu den interkulturellen Beziehungen zwischen einer europäischen Sichtweise und der traditionellen südpazifischen Sichtweise der Maori. Viel Freude Ihnen damit.
Ko te wai e hora nei, ko te marae e takoto nei, ko koutou aku rangatira kua pai nei, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. It's such an honor and a privilege to be here tonight, and I would like to thank the Humboldt Foundation and Humboldt-University and Your Excellency, the New Zealand Ambassador, all of you who've gathered here tonight for the privilege of talking to you this evening. And Alexander von Humboldt is here looking at me quizzically, and I want to honor him tonight in the things I have to say. So on the last page of Views of Nature, Alexander von Humboldt described his first sight of the Pacific Ocean from the Andes. He said, a great body of light reflecting, ascending to an horizon, now more than merely sensed. And he paid tribute to Georg Forster, the companion of his youth, who had sailed across the Pacific Ocean with Captain James Cook. And during their early travels together in Europe, Forster's enchanting descriptions of Tahiti, says von Humboldt, inspired him with a love of scientific exploration and a yearning to follow in his wake. Back at home in New Zealand, as I speak, we are also commemorating a 250th anniversary, the arrival of Captain Cook's ship, Endeavour, which brought the first Europeans ashore. Like Humboldt's South American journey, Cook's first Pacific voyage had soaring cosmological ambition: to observe the transit of Venus, and so to estimate the size of the solar system, and to search for Terra Australis Incognita, the great unknown southern continent, which was thought to lie in the deep south of the Pacific Ocean. Through Humboldt's friendship with Georg Forster, Cook's Pacific voyages helped to sow the seeds for his all-embracing vision of the cosmos, with its emphasis on fundamental questions about the workings of the world and the dynamic interconnections of all forms of life. Though Humboldt had hoped to join Captain Baudin's expedition in Lima, in Peru, the French explorer changed his plan to enter the Pacific Ocean around Cape Horn and sailed around the Cape of Good Hope instead. And thus, Alexander von Humboldt's ambition to explore the Pacific Ocean, the largest geographical feature on the planet, was frustrated. Perhaps because of this, both Views of Nature, his favourite book, and his masterwork Cosmos describe a largely terrestrial planet, rather than the watery world that we all in fact inhabit. This celebration of the 250th anniversary of Alexander von Humboldt's birth is being held here in Berlin, near the western edge of the world's largest landmass. Aotearoa, New Zealand, on the other hand, lies at the heart of the Pacific Ocean, the world's largest ocean. And I was delighted when I went to the exhibition yesterday at the Historic Museum to find this world map by Alexander von Humboldt. And what a greeting, because there was New Zealand, most unusually, at the heart of a world map. I thought it was like a personal greeting from Alexander von Humboldt, so kia ora. Very, very lovely to see that in the exhibition. This vast sea, which covers almost a third of the Earth's surface, has helped to shape our identity in New Zealand. Perhaps 80 million years ago, New Zealand floated away from the ancient continent of Gondwana land, evolving in isolation with its plants and animals. The naturalist Jared Diamond has described New Zealand as the world's smallest continent or the world's largest islands. For a biologist, he remarks, examining the New Zealand biota is the closest we will get, and I quote, the opportunity to study life on another planet. So before the first human beings came ashore, living systems had been co-adapting there for millennia, creating an extraordinary array of endemic species, including flightless birds, giant snails, even walking bats. We now know that the ancestors of many of these creatures floated, flew, or were blown there. They had to survive a long and difficult oceanic journey, or airborne, and adapt to environments very different from those in their homelands. And as they moved into new niches, this sparked rapid innovation and the emergence of new species. It seems that something similar may have happened in the case of human beings. In New Zealand, our ancestors had to be bold and innovative to cross the Pacific Ocean. In order to reach this very remote archipelago, the ancestors of Maori had to invent blue water sailing long before the Vikings crossed the deep ocean. And when the first star navigators from island Polynesia landed in New Zealand about 700 years ago, this became the last significant landmass on the planet to be found and settled by human beings. They also had to quickly adapt to landscapes very different from their tropical island homelands. So far from being a static, steady-state, traditional society, Māori life was dynamic and rapidly changing. And in the 450 years or so before European arrival with Cook, Māori invented a new language, cosmology, art forms, fashioned new kinds of watercraft and buildings, and mastered new fibre, stone, and agricultural technologies. Sometimes they made mistakes, setting fires that ran out of control and exploiting some local species to the point of extinction, including the moa, the large flightless bird that was their best source of protein. Nevertheless, the rate of successful innovation was very impressive, and different ways of life, products, and ideas emerged in different parts of the country. According to Maori philosophy, the world begins with a surge of energy, followed by knowledge, thought, memory, desire. And it wasn't until hauora and hautipu, the winds of growth and life, blew through the cosmos, that rangi and papa, the earth mother and the sky father, emerged, followed by stars, plants, animals, and people. In this way of thought and this way of being, all the world is a vast kin network, powered by the winds of life and growth, one living system, one source of life. And in this relational cosmos, mind and matter are not split, nor are knowledge and desire. Space-time is a spiral. Life returns to the ancestral source and then spins out again into the future. Earth and sky, stars, sea, winds, people, and other life forms are linked together, driven by mutual exchanges. When balance is achieved, families, communities, and ecosystems alike are in a state of order. Order is health, prosperity, well-being. If reciprocity fails, however, entire networks and their members begin to fail and become mate, or sick, unhealthy and dysfunctional. This can apply to individuals, to families, to communities, to countries, perhaps even to the planet. And this idea of a dynamic, pulsing cosmos is contemporary and futuristic, with patterns of complex networks and spirals that are also found in cutting-edge science. So like those first Polynesian voyages, the first Western explorers to arrive in New Zealand, Abel Tasman and Captain James Cook, faced formidable challenges. In order to cross the Pacific and reach these remote islands, European mariners had to perfect the art of sailing for long periods over great distances. In 1769, 250 years ago, when the Endeavour made its landfall on the east coast of New Zealand, the Royal Society scientists on board, led by the wealthy young botanist, Joseph Banks, whom Humboldt would meet 20 years later in London, thought that they had discovered Terra Australis Incognita, the great unknown southern continent, fabled to be rich in gold and silver and spices, with Rajas riding around on elephants. Instead, it turned out to be my hometown of Gisborne. And at that time, life in Europe was also in a phase of explosive innovation. Modernity began in Europe around the 1760s, just as the Endeavour brought the first Europeans ashore in New Zealand. The Royal Society of London, which had sponsored James Cook's expedition, was at the cutting edge of the Enlightenment, characterised by many new inventions in the arts, manufacturing, agriculture, governance, and science. On board the Endeavour, there was a cargo of colliding cosmological ideas. These included, for example, the old, originally Greek, but then later medieval motif of the great chain of being, which had God at the apex of the cosmos, followed by a divine monarch and the serried ranks of the aristocracy, down to commoners, barbarians, and savages, sentient and non-sentient animals, insects, plants, and rocks. And those at the bottom of the great chain were expected to offer up deference and tribute to those at the top, who exercised top-down authority and control. And this was partly based on ancient mythic framings, including, for example, the Genesis story of creation, which gave Adam and Eve, as we all know from the Bible, dominion over fish, plants, birds, animals, men over women, and so on. In the logic of the great chain of being, a divine sovereign ruled over his or her people, which gives you the notion of sovereignty in a hierarchical, God-given form of cosmic order. Aristocrats ruled over commoners, civilized people over barbarians and savages, free citizens over slaves, human beings over all other life forms. And on board a naval vessel like the Endeavour, this form of order was mirrored in the chain of command from the commander to the cabin boy. When time was added to the great chain of being, stadial theories of human history emerged, an unfolding of human progress from the savages who were hunters and gatherers, to barbarians who were herders and agriculturalists, to civilized commercial and industrial societies. This ancient mythic framing has proved to be curiously resilient. It still underpins many contemporary ideas about relationships amongst people. The sovereignty of nation states, for example. Sexism and the idea of the glass ceiling. Racism and the domination of civilized over indigenous peoples. People over all other life forms. In resource management and ecosystem services, for example, which assume that these life forms were created for the uses and purposes of people. Many corporate structures also echo this form of order with their hierarchies and top-down styles of control. In contemporary capitalism, 99% of people are expected to offer up deference and tribute to the 1% who now own most of the planet. In Enlightenment science, a second powerful framing device was Cartesian dualism, and this has been greatly studied by many philosophers and historians. And when the French philosopher René Descartes set up the thinking subject as the guarantor of his own existence, with cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, he conjured up a world in which mind was split from matter. Res cogitans versus res extensa, subject from object, reason from the emotions, culture from nature, people from the environment, and ultimately the social from the physical sciences. In this way of knowing, reality was transformed into arrays of bounded objects at different scales that could be counted, classified, and commodified. The order of things, as Michel Foucault has called it, through the quantification of space, time, people, and other life forms. Back in the 18th century, as the order of things went viral, many aspects of life were transformed simultaneously with the invention of censuses, of surveying, bureaucracy, industry with mechanization and replicable processes, and science with the use of instruments and quantification. Also the split between the natural sciences and the arts, and their fragmentation into different disciplines, the origins of siloed thinking. On board the Endeavour, this kind of thought was exemplified in part by the ship's log, with its gridding of both time and space, the classification of plants and animals using Linnaean taxonomy, and Cook's charts of the Pacific with their gridded latitude and longitude and their eye of God perspective. So this order of things, you might say, at this time in the mid-18th century, gridded the world. And this has been transforming space into time ever since, into commodities that could be bought and sold in the market. And many contemporary inheritors of this kind of gridded habit of mind, which is a cultural artifact, not the way the world is or has to be. It laid the basis for ideas of objectivity, empirical knowledge based on detached observation, experiment and control, and contemporary capitalism with its ruling ideas of ownership and the autonomous, property-owning, rights-bearing individual. But a third strand of Enlightenment thinking, which I've sometimes called the order of relations, relational thinking, in this kind of way of thinking, which was simultaneous, it was the same in the same period, the iconic form of order was the web. And at this time in Europe, thinkers including Buffon in France, Erasmus Darwin, Joseph Priestley, and most of the Scottish Enlightenment, Charles Darwin in England later, and Alexander von Humboldt in Germany, saw the world as a web of life, shaped by networks of relations among and within different life forms, animated by interactions among complementary forces. People live in the heart of these complex relational networks and are not separated from them in this way of thought. And as it happens, this kind of habit of mind resonates closely with Maori and Pacifica cosmological ideas and contemporary ecological thinking as well. In his masterwork Cosmos, for example, Alexander von Humboldt writes about a wonderful web of organic life that was animated by one breath. From pole to pole, one life is poured on rocks, plants, animals, and even into the swelling breast of man. A breath that came from the earth itself, a vision that bears an uncanny resemblance to Te Ao Māori, the Māori cosmos, with its array of complex networks animated by Hau, the breath of life. In this web of life, people are just one life form among many, and the world is constantly changing. Ancestral ideas from Europe, such as justice, truth, equality, and honour, help to determine how exchanges among people ought to be handled. On board the Endeavour, Cook's ship, this kind of thinking was reflected in the hints given to Captain Cook by the Earl of Morton, who was at that point the president of the Royal Society of London, a Scottish astronomer, who insisted on the rights of Indigenous people to own and protect and defend their own territories. So he disputed and totally disagreed with the idea of the right of discovery, for example. Here one can also find, in this kind of thinking, the origins of participatory democracy, and here we find Alexander von Humboldt so much at home. The emancipation of women and slaves, the earth sciences, evolutionary and environmental theory, the World Wide Web, the science of complex systems, for example, these patterns of webs and networks, animated, living, constantly evolving and changing. So in Aotearoa, New Zealand, during those very first encounters between Māori and Europeans, both sides were riding the waves of rapid change. On both sides, they were fighting sailors, bold and innovative explorers who had mastered the art of exploring the world's largest ocean, people who were thinking creatively about the world around them. And as soon as Cook scientists stepped ashore, they began to explore local landscapes. They looked at and described local people, what they looked like, what they wore, their vessels and landscapes, and collected specimens of plants and animals. And as was the case with the first Polynesian settlers, those first European migrants to New Zealand were provoked into a flurry of innovation. The challenges of a long, often very dangerous sea voyage and adapting to new and unfamiliar landscapes taught those first European settlers about the need to innovate and to support each other, while a desire to escape the old encrusted hierarchies of Europe engendered an egalitarian spirit of sorts. In 1840, when the New Zealand Company began sending unauthorised shiploads of settlers to New Zealand, the British government was forced to intervene and instructed the incoming governor to seek the free, intelligent consent of the natives, expressed according to their own usages, to a settled form of government. This led to the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, which, if you read it in Māori, outlines a balance of powers between the leaders of the indigenous hapu, or kin groups, and the British Crown. In later years, these kind of relational habits of mind were also reflected in the early emancipation of women. So on this day in 1893, today, women in New Zealand, including Maori women, became the first in the world to vote. On this day in 1893. There was a growing fascination with native plants, animals and landscapes, and attempts to adapt to local environments. But at the same time, those old top-down, hierarchical modes of control remained very, very powerful. Again, the old myths, including the Genesis creation story and the great chain of being, made it seem right and proper that civilized peoples should subdue the earth and have dominion over local plants, animals, and people. And as the new settlers sought to recreate familiar landscapes, they took political control and forcibly seized land from Māori and introduced plants and animals without much thought about how these would work in with local ecosystems. Many indigenous species of plants and animals lost their habitats over the next couple of hundred years or have been predated or hunted to extinction. Ideas of progress and improvement led to the wholesale clearance of land, the drainage of swamps and wetlands, the creation of large swathes of grassland for pastoral farming on steep, erodible hills. The idea that the world was created to serve human beings who can exploit it without limit led to systems of land use that led to severe erosion, choking waterways and harbours, the discharge of pollutants into streams, rivers, lakes and harbours. They struggle to survive these loadings of contaminants with catastrophic losses of biodiversity. And that's without even talking about climate change and what is happening in the Antarctic, for example, at the moment, and across the Pacific with our island neighbours, as well as in New Zealand. As Lord Nicholas Stern has said, we are playing Russian roulette with the planet, and the risks are existential. It couldn't be more serious. So for a long time, the Humboldtian vision of the cosmos as a dynamic whole, shaped by exchanges amongst complex living systems, was marginalised in modernist science. Today, however, radical divisions between mind and matter, culture from nature, people from the environment, and the disciplines from each other are being confounded by the findings of contemporary science itself. Brain science, quantum physics, the environmental sciences, for instance. And at the same time, the scientific establishment is being challenged by an array of formidable, almost apocalyptic challenges. Climate change, losses of biodiversity, the warming and acidification of the oceans with their anthropogenic causes and impacts, and rising disparities in wealth and power and life chances, all of which demand a capacity from the scientific community to decipher the intricate dynamics of exchanges amongst interconnected, complex systems. In response, we are seeing an increasing focus on interdisciplinarity, relational forms of order, big data, symbiosis and its complex dynamic networks and exchanges, and attempts at a more inclusive, less fragmented understanding of the scientific project. But in many ways, this could be too little, too late. In our rapidly changing world, old habits of mind, in science as well as in our wider societies, are proving to be non-adaptive. As Alexander von Humboldt saw so clearly 200 years ago, challenges such as climate change, the degradation of waterways and the ocean, losses of biodiversity, are driven by human choices and actions. For this reason, it makes little sense to leave climate change to the climate scientists, losses of biodiversity to the biologists, the health of rivers, lakes and wetlands to the freshwater scientists. And yet, that's almost inevitably what happens. As a matter of urgency, the scientific project, with its radical split between the natural and social sciences, should be reframed you might say in a Humboldtian manner, to bring people back into the heart of these living networks so we can better understand our relationships with each other and with these wider living systems and bring them back into balance. We also need to set aside those old echoes of the great chain of being that dismiss indigenous philosophies and ways of thinking. Earlier, I noted a resonance between Humboldt's idea of the cosmos as a web of life, a living system, and Maori relational thinking and Pacifica. In New Zealand, some intriguing intersections are happening between these different philosophical trajectories. In 1975, for example, after generations of Māori protest about the loss of land and tikanga, customary ways of living, the Treaty of Waitangi Act was passed. This act established the Waitangi Tribunal to investigate and remedy breaches of the promises made in 1840 under the Treaty of Waitangi. Since that time, hundreds of claims have been lodged by Māori with the tribunal, addressing grievances that range from the loss or degradation of ancestral fisheries, lakes, rivers, forests, and harbours. Te reo Māori, the Māori language, indigenous plants and animals, as well as ancestral territories that were unjustly sold or confiscated. Over time, this process of debate and legal disputation has led to increasingly profound challenges to Western ways or modernist ways of thinking and governing. So in 2017, for example, in response to the Whanganui River Treaty claim, Te Awa Tupua Whanganui River Act was passed by the New Zealand Parliament, in which for the first time in the world, a river was recognised as a legal entity in its own right, with its own rights. As Whanganui people say, ko au te awa, ko te awa ko au, ke te mate te awa, ke te mate ahau. I am the river, and the river is me. If the river is dying, so am I. And indeed, we do have a lot of waterborne disease in New Zealand at present. So after 250 years of shared history, inspired by these Māori insights, a nation-state has reimagined its relationship with the river. And this is now being extended into other policy areas around freshwater, for example, with Te Mana o Te Wai as part of the freshwater national policy statement, where the health of waterways is to be given priority over human uses. This kind of convergence between philosophical trajectories is also evident, I think, in the New Zealand government's 2019 wellbeing budget, which places a priority on the health and well-being of people and landscapes over profit. Well, that's debatable, but that seems to be a general aspiration. And the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, a young female Prime Minister, seeks a politics of kindness, and it draws on Māori ideas of ora, health and prosperity, well-being, and as our ambassador quoted, manaakitanga, looking after others, taking care of them, aroha, empathy, sympathy and fellow feeling. Notably, I guess, in her response to the 2018 mosque shootings in Christchurch, in which 51 Muslim people were killed at prayer and 49 were injured. At a time of public grief and horror in New Zealand, it was notable how many New Zealanders, including non-Māori, turned to Māori conceptions like aroha, empathy, fellow feeling, whānau, family, to express their sympathy for the victims, and defiance to the shooter. In the Pacific, you can see a similar kind of philosophical entanglement going on. So, for example, recently, His Highness Tuiatua Tupua Tamasese Paisiefi, the former head of state of Samoa, in a book on climate change, urged his readers to think like a fish in addressing climate change. Think from the vantage point of the ocean, or a bird, or a fish. And in context of attempts that are being made to sustainably manage the Pacific Ocean and its fisheries. These exclusive economic zones, which take continental habits of how to deal with land, continental land masses, if we think like a fish, we might understand that fish don't recognise these boundaries. In fact, they swim right through them all the time and get hoovered up by trawlers. And try and come up with devices that might imagine ways of working with the world's largest ocean in a way that preserves these other life forms from extinction. As part of what is going on in New Zealand at the moment, a waka, a flotilla of voyaging canoes, is travelling around, and its leaders are in the process of drafting a declaration of the rights of the Pacific Ocean, Hinemoana, as a way of trying to come up with an oceanic alternative to the law of the sea, which was drafted in Europe and based on continental ways of dealing with space, and which is simply not working. And they are looking for oceanic alternatives. So hierarchical habits of mind tend to uphold the status quo. They stifle philosophical creativity, the kinds of experiments which enable us to look outside our own ingrained, entrenched, unconscious forms of order. And those hierarchical habits can also stifle and conflict with academic freedom, the rights of scientists and scholars to freely communicate the patterns that they're finding. From Humboldt's time, academic freedom has been built into notions of participatory democracy, with built-in checks and balances between the judiciary, a free press, the legislature, and universities as communities of scholars who are free to explore the world and report on their findings without fear of political or economic reprisal. This is fundamental to the vitality of the scientific project, allowing new ideas and insights to be freely debated and experimented with. As von Humboldt himself said, without a diversity of opinion, the discovery of truth is impossible. And I think he would have liked a diversity of opinion that goes beyond the modernist project. I think he would have enjoyed it. But it goes with corresponding responsibilities to reach out to the widest possible array of talented people, enriching scientific inquiry with their diverse experiences, perspectives, and ancestral legacies, and to make scholarly findings accessible to the wider community, acknowledging them and thanking them for supporting scientific work with funding and other kinds of backing, including the privilege of academic freedom. The viability of the scientific project itself, I think, relies on this mutuality between scholars and their communities. When trust and mutuality between scientists and society are violated, science itself becomes vulnerable. In recent years, there have been many reports of scientific work being shut down in the Pacific as elsewhere, of databases and information sources, including those created by public funding, being declared inaccessible, and some scientists being threatened and intimidated because their findings threaten powerful commercial or political interests. For the sake of the scientific project itself, it's vital that scholars support each other in resisting these pressures and in strengthening their relations with the wider community, so that they will back the scientific community in retaining its integrity and its experimental spirit. After all, as Alexander von Humboldt understood so well, the deepest purpose of science is to illuminate the patterns of the wider world, to delight and inform the communities that support our endeavours, and to contribute to their order, their health, their well-being, their prosperity, including that of the non-human communities of which we are a part. And as communities of scholars, we must hold fast to our independence and have the courage and skill to protect the free exchange of ideas from those who would curtail these freedoms for their own purposes. So bringing together these worlds, tangling them together, I would like to end by quoting my mentor and kaumātua elder Edwina Sterling, who used to chant, whakarongo, whakarongo, whakarongo ki te tangi a te manu e karanga nei tui, 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 tui a. Listen, listen, listen to the cry of the bird calling, bind, join, be one. Bind above, bind below, bind within, bind without, tie the knot of humankind. The night hears, the night hears, bind the lines of people coming down from long Hawaii, from great Hawaii, from Hawaii far away, bind to the spirit, to the daylight, to the world of light. Nā reira, I aku rangatira. Ko tīnai ne tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora.
Ja, das war der Vortrag von Professor Dame Salmond. Und mir hat ja ein ganz kleiner Satz sehr gut gefallen. I am the river is me. Und als Hydrogeologin kann ich mich mit diesem ganzen Wasserthematik auch sehr identifizieren und finde es einen ganz spannenden Perspektivwechsel.
Ja, toller Vortrag. Ich bin da jedes Mal begeistert, wenn ich mir da wieder Ausschnitte oder den ganzen Vortrag angucke. In der nächsten Folge nehmen wir Sie wieder mit in den Kosmos von Alexander von Humboldt. Oliver Lubrich wird über Humboldt als Politiker, Kompromiss und die Chancen, dann doch etwas zu bewegen, referieren. Das ist spannend, das ist politisch hochinteressant, rekurriert auf das 19. Jahrhundert und wirft aber eben Fragen auf, die uns nach wie vor betreffen und uns berühren. Und bis dahin freue ich mich, Sie wiederzusehen in der nächsten Folge unseres Kosmos-Streaming-Formats. Auf Wiedersehen.
Tschüss.